Russian President Vladimir Putin has hailed the soldiers fighting in Ukraine as heroes hours after ordering that partial mobilization. To help us understand what this will mean on the ground in Ukraine, we are joined by Mark Akansian. He's the senior advisor at CSIS and also a retired Marine colonel. He joins us from Arlington, Virginia. Colonel, thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin with your thoughts on Putin's announcement. Is this a sign that he's struggling? And why do you think he announced a partial mobilization instead of a full-scale one?
There's no question that the Russians are struggling. You have to keep in mind that the Russian military is not very large. The total military is about 900,000. The army may be 280,000. This is not the Soviet army of 3.5 million. It's much smaller, in fact, than the U.S. armed forces. And then they've taken a lot of casualties, maybe 80,000 casualties. So they've been struggling to fill their ranks and even trying to expand. They've offered a lot of incentives for people to come into the service. They've offered incentives for people to go to Ukraine, but they just haven't been able to fill their ranks. The quality's been declining. So they've taken this next step of calling up a lot of reservists to fill their ranks and enable them to stay in the war.
NATO Sec Gen Jens Stoltenberg, he says that the only way to end this war is to prove that President Putin will not win on the battlefield. And when he realizes that, he has to sit down and negotiate a reasonable agreement with Ukraine. Do you agree?
I think it's going to be very difficult to negotiate an agreement. The two sides are very far apart. One element or one aspect of this referendum that the Russians are talking about in the Donbass is it will make it harder for the Ukrainians to negotiate some sort of agreement. The Russians say that they're going to take over all of Ukraine, or at least hold on to what they have. The Ukrainians want them out of all of Ukraine. I don't see any negotiations possible until one side has essentially decided to give up the fight.
How long does it usually take to mobilize 300,000 troops, Colonel? And how worried do you think President Zelensky should be of the latest announcement by Mr. Putin?
It's going to take quite a while. This is a half step that Russia is taking. They did not order full mobilization. It's partial mobilization. Even that is turning out to be quite politically sensitive. You've seen the pictures of the demonstrations. These are people who have already been in the military, have been released, and are basically names on a list. Now they're being called back into service. Some of them have been out for a long time. It's going to take a while to train them up. Even if once they're trained, they're probably not going to be terribly high quality. You have to keep in mind that the Russians don't have a reserve system the way that the U.S. does, or many European countries do. In the U.S., the reserve unit might train 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer, and then on mobilization have a couple of months of training. Russian reservists don't have anything like this. They're really just names on lists. It's going to take a long time, and these are not going to be very high-quality units.
The Kremlin has for months sought to maintain a sense of domestic normalcy despite its invasion of Ukraine. Is that still possible following the military call-up? And you add to that the reports of protests and Russians heading to borders?
Well, we'll certainly see. The fact that they're calling up more reservists means that more elements of Russian society are going to be affected by the war. Putin has tried very hard to insulate the population from the war, arguing this is a special military operation. It's not a war. This is going to bring that home to more families. We've seen some demonstrations against this action. Remember, there were a number of demonstrations early on when the war began, but Putin was able to suppress those pretty effectively. And he's dominated the infosphere in Russia. He has control over all of the media. They've been putting out Russian propaganda, and that's been pretty successful. I'm sure he's going to try to do that again. We'll see if he can keep a lid on it.
And Colonel, Putin also made a new veiled sort of a nuclear warning towards the West, saying that he'll use all means at his disposal to protect Russia's territory. How serious should we take his threats, and how likely is it that Putin will unleash a nuclear war?
Well, Putin has been rattling his nuclear saber since the beginning of the war. In fact, even before the war, he talked about nuclear weapons. And basically, he's laid out two conditions that might engender a nuclear response. One is for NATO troops to enter Ukraine and engage the Russians directly. And the other is if Ukrainian forces push into the Russian homeland. So far, both sides have respected those lines. U.S. intelligence says that the Russians are not taking any actions that would indicate that they were preparing to use nuclear weapons or undertake nuclear operations. Still, it's very irresponsible to rattle the nuclear saber. One thing that has people a little nervous is that if these areas are incorporated into Russia, or at least in Russian eyes, would they be covered by this nuclear umbrella, and would that engender a response if the Ukrainian counteroffensive continued? That's unlikely, but it does raise another concern.
Yeah, speaking of the counteroffensive, Ukraine and its allies must have anticipated that this could result in escalation. Will it change their military calculations or approach?
I'm not sure if it will change their calculations. It certainly puts some pressure, though, on the Ukrainians to try to get as much territory as they can before these new reservists start showing up on the front lines. That's going to take a while, though, so they have a little time to continue this offensive. But I think this indicates also that Russia's preparing for a long war. Ukrainians have been preparing for a long war. The United States has stated that it's going to support them in the long war. So I think we're going to see this go on for months more, unfortunately.
And Colonel, this comes in the wake of the referendums about joining Russia in occupied territories. What impact would this have on peace negotiations going forward, and what will it take to end the stalemate?
Well, this is clearly going to make any negotiations more difficult. If the referendums go through and Russia claims this as part of its territory, then it would be giving up some territory it claimed as its own. You have to keep in mind that Russia sees all of Ukraine as part of its territory. Putin is trying to reestablish the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire of many centuries. He regards this as part of Russia. Unfortunately, I think I don't see any good basis for negotiations. I think the war is going to continue for quite some time. I think all the West can do is to keep supplying the Ukrainians with diplomatic support and particularly weapons and munitions. And over time, they may wear down the Russians and be able to push them out. That's going to take time.
All right, Colonel, thank you very much for your time and your insights this morning. Mark Cancian, retired Marine Colonel and Senior Advisor at CSIS.